a good start. So we're going to kick it off. So, welcome to Ridge Vineyards Spring 2021 virtual tasting. Good morning from California. My name is David Amadia. I'm the president of Ridge, and it'll be my pleasure to moderate today's tasting. So today we'll be tasting our spring release wines. Interestingly today, or this tasting marks our 10th anniversary of our first virtual tasting. It feels like yesterday, but it is 10 years. So we do feel like we've been pioneers in this field, but clearly over the last year through COVID and Zoom, virtual tastings have become somewhat normal. But we're launching another innovation today, and I think obviously a lot of you are aware of it. The big innovation is the use of tasting packs. So with a great deal of coordination, and a big thank you to Murphy and Heidi, we've distributed 500 tasting packs across the US containing vials with the 6 wines we'll be tasting today. So hopefully you've safely received your tasting pack and you have the 6 wines poured out in front of you. The wines that we'll be tasting in order today are as follows: the 2019 Estate Chardonnay, 2019 Three Valleys, 2019 Paso Robles Zinfandel, 2019 East Bench Zinfandel, 2019 Geyserville, and then the 6th wine will be the 2018 Estate Cabernet. So a little Zoom housekeeping. Please use the Q&A function to send your questions through to our production panelists. And we do greatly encourage the questions. It adds a lot of energy and vigor to the presentation. So please feel free to send through the questions. And feel free to use chats to chat amongst yourself. Let us know where you're at, what's going on. Ridge, we'll also have Ridge staff monitoring both the chat and the Q&A function. Let's see, we'd like to welcome a new distributor, Winebow in North Carolina, who took over the responsibility for Ridge in North Carolina on the 1st of April. So we're very happy and very excited to be with them in North Carolina. We're with Winebow through most of the mid-Atlantic states, and it's nice to be with them in North Carolina. So a big welcome to them. We'll talk a little bit as we go through the presentation about the vials and how the wines are tasting coming out of the vials, but we don't want to spend too much time on that. So let me introduce our panelists. First, I'll introduce David Gates. David Gates is our Senior VP of Vineyard Operations. And as David always says, if he can survive it, this will be his 32nd vintage at Ridge coming up. And has seen it all. And we're happy to have David with us this morning. John Olney, who's just recently been promoted to head winemaker at Ridge and is moving into his 25th vintage here at the winery as well. So a big welcome to John. And then I need to check back. Paul Draper is scheduled to join us today. He's not joined us yet, but we do expect Paul to pop in and participate in the tasting this morning. And Paul's first vintage at Ridge was 1969, so way over 50 years of dedication to Ridge on his resume. So hopefully he'll be able to join us, and we're looking forward to his participation. So I think we can jump into the wines now, and I think maybe I'll ask David Gates to kick us off and talk about the 2019 Estate Chardonnay.
Thanks, David. Welcome, everyone. We've been making Chardonnay. I used to say that it was one of our best kept secrets. We've been making it every year since Ridge was commercially open, so since 1962. The Santa Cruz Mountains is a great place to grow and produce Chardonnay. It combines the ripeness that you can expect from a Chardonnay in California, so all that beautiful fruitiness, along with a really great acidity. On Montebello, which is, as you can see, about an hour or so south of San Francisco, depending on how fast you drive. We're up in the hills, so most of our Chardonnay is grown kind of on limestone-ish soils that are right at the inversion layer, so that the bay that you see just north of above Montebello on the map fills up with fog. It was filled with fog this morning, and it lifts up to about 15 to 16 to 1800 feet, somewhere in there. And so it keeps the nights and mornings very cool where most of the Chardonnay grows. And then it warms up then in the afternoon as that fog lifts and burns off, and the valley fills up with warm air. And that really, I think, helps with our Chardonnay. The other thing that helps us grow Chardonnay and Cabernet in the same place and get them both nicely ripe is that most of the Chardonnay faces east and it's on slopes, so that it's not really getting a lot of afternoon sun. As you can see on this map, that the Chardonnay is kind of facing to the east and north. The hills are steep. Anyone that has visited our Montebello facility and driving up Montebello Road, it's called Santa Cruz Mountains for a reason. It's quite mountainous and very steep. So that really does help the Chardonnay get ripe. Just like with our red wines, pretty much across all of the wines that we make, we look at each of the different parcels and pick them as they ripen. And often, especially with Chardonnay, we have I think we have 9 or 10 different blocks of Chardonnay and clones within blocks. And then we end up picking those probably about 18 times. So many of the blocks will pick selectively. We call it green and stressed. You can understand why. It's not the people, well, the people get stressed at harvest, but the vines growing in weaker soils ripen more quickly, and they have a little bit different flavor profile. We don't want to pick them along with the grapes in the same block that are growing in the swale and deeper soil. So we'll pick those off separately, and then ferment them separately, and then it's all barrel fermented, as everyone knows. We're mostly American oak barrels now, and not very much new, maybe 20% new, and it's right around 10%. And John, please correct me if I'm wrong, but it's right around 10% French oak that we still use with our Chardonnay. That kind of started to change in the 90s, where before the mid 90s, we were all French oak on the Chardonnay. Again, most of it used, but then we kind of started segueing into American oak as the oak cooperages got better at, and we learned more about American oak. I've always liked. I'll say it again. Like I started, Santa Cruz Mountains is a great place to grow Chardonnay, and it's a very versatile grape, and I think it does really well. Not just here at Ridge, but across the Santa Cruz Mountains.
So John, just talking a little bit more about the winemaking, this is really made in a very traditional fashion, very similar to top producers in Burgundy. And it's a full throttle Chardonnay in terms of the winemaking techniques, but still comes off with this really nice lightness to it. So maybe talk about the winemaking and how we're able to achieve that.
Yeah, absolutely. And hello to everyone. And thank you for joining us. So, I think that, white winemaking in general it seems deceptively simple in some ways. You bring the grapes in and, you immediately press them and then just move straight into fermentation. But, one of the tricks or one of the difficulties, complications, I think, in making a really, a high quality white wine is that, in white wine, we want the wine to always be refreshing, not to be too heavy. So how do you maintain that freshness, that liveliness in the wine, and yet, have enough concentration and complexity in the flavor, to give the wine that extra interest. And that's really, to me, again, I think it comes down to, where it's grown. There's no question that you can grow Chardonnay. You can grow Chardonnay just about in every corner of the planet, and certainly it's grown throughout California. I think what's unique at Montebello is just that the elevation, the soil, it's warm enough, like David said, sort of facing east, that we get the richness. But at the same time, we're close enough to the Pacific Ocean that we're retaining that natural acidity. And it really, it's again, when you have the right varietal, the right soil, and the right microclimate, it really comes together to give you that richness, and yet still without being heavy. And to me, that's kind of the trick. And what that allows us to do, is then when we do bring the grapes in, we do a whole cluster pressing. We let the wine settle overnight in tank, and then we go straight to barrel. And as David mentioned, initially for the first 30, 40, almost 40 years of making Chardonnay at Ridge, it was one of the few wines where we still continued to use French oak. And then in the 90s, as we continued to work with specific coopers in the US, we were able to bring in more American oak, to the point at which today, French oak is actually less than 10%. But, we stir the lees every week, during and right after fermentation. We let the wine go through a full malolactic. There's about 10% new oak, and also some 1-year-old oak, which gives the wine a little influence. But, we're able to make a wine that has that richness again. And not only is it not heavy, but one of the really interesting things I think about Montebello Chardonnay is that it actually has, the ability to age really, really well. I mean, we've had wines. I recently had the 2004, which was, surprisingly fresh and really a beautiful wine. So obviously enjoyable right now, but it's neat and kind of rare to have a white wine that really does age the way this one does.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times I've been tasting this wine with people, and they would ask me, this wine has not gone through malolactic at all, has it? And then when I let them know, no, it's 100% malolactic fermentation on this wine, they're really shocked. And that really is a sort of a tribute to the cool climate and the limestone and the winemaking to sort of create that. And as we talked about before, it's sort of a Chardonnay for everyone, for those who want the full throttle Chardonnay with 100% malo, barrel fermentation, barrel aging. It provides that. But for those who want a leaner Chardonnay too, it provides that as well. So it's kind of an interesting wine. There's not too many Chardonnays like this in California, and really unique. I always hesitate to answer these questions because it always creates problems, but we had 2 of them, so we're gonna have to deal with it. Is that, what is the difference between Montebello Chardonnay and the estate? We have not really been releasing the Montebello Chardonnay to the domestic market because the volumes have been so small. So that's why the hesitancy. But I think it is important for people to understand that on certain vintages, we do declare it. So what are we looking for there, John, in those particular vintages?
Well, I think that, it really comes, I think that, if you look into sort of the basis in a way of Ridge winemaking, to me, it all starts with the selection process. So, and that taking the Chardonnay as an example, in 2019, we had 12 different parcels, so therefore 12 different fermentations. And as we followed each wine and watched it mature, what we have found over the years is that frequently some of the parcels that are at the higher elevations tend to have a bit more of an austerity to them, a bit more of a minerality to them. So that generally is what steers us towards making, an actual Montebello. But it is, in other words, a selection process of individual parcels. I see that Paul's joined us here.
Sure, John, I was going to join you. Sorry to come in late, but we have computer problems or internet problems up here. I had to move down to the lower. Anyway, yeah, we've got 23 parcels and all quite small, and 3 of them are on the Klein Ranch, and we've worked with since '85. And we pick 2 of them in 2 different passes, the stressed and the green. And the 3rd one, we actually pick as much as 3 times. So, and we keep all of these in separate barrels. So when they finish fermenting and we make the selection, as John says, we've got, just from Klein alone, we've got a number of wines to look at. And in 19, the 2 that, as you said, from the upper vineyards that stood out for Montebello were the very young Lone Tree, which is planted to the Mount Eden clone, and then the Rooston, one of the Rooston 4 parcels that's planted to the Old Wenty. And those 2 we kept separate, very small amount, for the Montebello, the 19 Montebello. The rest, basically in tasting, we could include virtually all of them in the estate and come up with something that we were really proud of. David filled me in that huge amount of rain we had in 19 in the winter was fine, but going into the spring, it really interfered with scent and gave us yields that were somewhat lower than average and lower than last year. So unfortunately, with the estate and the Montebello, we're not going to have quite as much as we did last year. So that's a little tough, but it's just, well, John, why don't you describe the wine?
Well, I mean, I think the 19 for me is a wine that you know, has all the sort of Chardonnay character to it. You've got a lot of apple, you've got a lot of pear. There's a little bit of oak influence, although I think that we dialed that back quite a bit in 19 to sort of match the concentration of the wine. But you know, again, I think right now it's got that nice sort of citrus element to it that really is complemented by that acidity, lots of freshness to the wine. You know, I think it is quite young, but I think it's drinking beautifully.
Great.
Terrific. Well, welcome, Paul. You don't need an introduction, but I did introduce you at the outset before you got here, just so you know.
They just got me set up, or I would have been a little more on time.
No worries. No worries. Glad you could join us. So somehow we managed to spend 15 minutes on our smallest production wines. We should probably move on. But why don't we move forward to Paso Robles? And David, why don't you, it's 100% Zin, and the second wine you Spanish as well. So that'll be interesting to try these 2 wines back to back. But maybe talk a little bit about the Ducey family, who we've been working with for decades in Paso.
Sure, David. Do we want to touch on Three Valleys first?
Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped right over that one. You know, we should probably talk about Three Valleys. Why don't I flip that back to John then and talk about how the winemaking for this is so much different than all of our single vineyard wines, and how the Valleys is actually put together.
Yeah, so this, you know, the Three Valleys is, you know, our one non-single vineyard wine. That is, it's made up of, you know, many different lots from all of our different, or most of our various vineyards. So again, sort of, in the end, it's a product of that whole selection process that I was talking about. So in any given year, if we take, for example, Lytton Springs, or we take, for example, the Geyserville, you know, we could have 20, 25, 30 different fermentations from every different parcel within the blocks that make up those vineyards. And after malolactic, we'll taste through them, and in any given year, we'll select out what we really think to be the top lots, the wines that are really going to make the most sort of typical and best single vineyard in that year. The other blocks, which are perfectly good, but maybe just don't have quite the intensity that we're looking at, those are the ones which we then assemble into our Three Valleys. So Three Valleys has always been a Zinfandel-based wine, but of course you have the other complementary varietals such as Petite Syrah and Carignan that are part of the blend. So, you know, very different, again, in that sense that, you know, this is the one wine which is really based on blending much more than on just, you know, based just on the vineyard and the potential of the vineyard that it's coming from.
Yeah, this really is, like we say, a winemaker's wine, where you're really in control of the blend and putting the parcels together to create something that is consistent with the Three Valley style, which, you know, has been around for many, many years. So you as the winemaker are in a lot more control of this than a single vineyard wine, which hopefully in a lot of ways makes itself. So for those who were with us a year ago, you know, the 2019 harvest was the largest in our history, and the 2019 Three Valleys reflects that. So we have a very good supply of this wine. In fact, it's going to last us all the way through 21 and into 22. So, so in terms of from a selling perspective, you know, no worries about out of stocks or anything of that nature on this wine. We are in a good supply situation. The 20 will be a little bit smaller than the 19, but still enough to keep us going all the way through next year. So I think I'm going to move to the Paso now, and I'm going to ask David to jump back in and talk about Paso as a growing region and the Ducey family and our relationship with that vineyard. David, I'm not hearing you.
Yeah, I thought I hit unmute. Oh well, it's a Zoom. You should have Zoom mug saying push unmute. We've been working with Paso Robles for many years, every year since 1976. But actually, the first vintage of Paso Robles was 1967, and for most of those years, Benito Ducey was growing the grapes, and Benny passed a couple of years ago now, and his nephew Mike Ducey, who is Benny's older brother Dante's son, has been doing the farming along with quite a few other acres of grapes that the Ducey family farms. Doing a great job. It's a beautiful little vineyard just off the Salinas River. You can see there's some hills, a little bit of hills in the property. It's all alluvium, fairly recent, and very rocky soils. The soil has limestone in it, so it's different limestone than Montebello down in the Paso Robles region. It's much more recent, with lots of big skeletons in it and whatnot. So all of the Benito Ducey vineyard is kind of a washout from those hills of limestone. The vines are deeply rooted, traditionally farmed. They actually start out as 1 and 2 bud spurs down low to the ground, and then as the vines get older, they grow up a little bit bigger. The oldest vines date from the 1920s. They were own-rooted though, and this soil does support phylloxera. So starting about 50 or so years ago, the vines were in some areas were kind of slowly dying off. So Benny, being a good farmer, great farmer, would gradually, 100 vines this year, 100 vines the next year, whatever, would replant as those points spread. So right now, there's about maybe 5 of the 25 acres are still remaining vines from the 20s. The rest of them are all replants on resistant rootstock, but they range in age from 2 or 3 years old to almost 50 years old. So it's a remarkable vineyard. The climate there, it's in the Templeton Gap, so it can get very cool at night and early mornings when not a lot of fog typically, but very cool winds that start up in the afternoon. But it can get very warm in the day. So it makes a Zinfandel that is very mouth-filling with its aromas and intensity of fruit, but not a lot of tannin. And that's one of its hallmarks, I think, is that it really fills your mouth up as you're tasting it, and then it just kind of disappears so that you can easily have another sip, another cup, or another glass. it makes a really typical classic Paso Robles wine.
John, this generally sort of kicks off our harvest package. I mean, these are generally the first grapes that will come into the winery in most years, unless we're working in Contra Costa County, which we do occasionally, but for the most part, this is the first grapes to come in. Do you want to talk a little bit about the winemaking and the style of the wine that David was referring to?
Sure, and there's no question, again, being one of the few Zinfandels we make, which is 100% Zinfandel, and that coupled, with the warm climate of Paso Robles, this is a Zinfandel, I think, that really exemplifies, sort of what the grape as a varietal is about. It's a very, very fruit forward wine, very round, sort of lush. Interestingly, it's also one of the wines which we use in terms of fermentation. We've typically used a submerged cap approach to in the winemaking, where we are basically keeping the skins in constant contact with the juice by pushing the cap down. And that was something that started, certainly long before I ever joined Ridge. And Paul, maybe do you want to say a few words about sort of how we got there, or what?
Sure. Yeah, the French call it chapeau submergé, submerged cap or hat.
Mm-hmm.
And one reason we got into it was that we found in one of the old properties on the mountain that's was making wine back in the 1870s and 80s and making Zinfandel, that they had these wooden grids that were exactly what the French were using for submerged cap. And so it was a tradition that came over to California very, very early on. And because initially the partners here at Ridge in the 60s were still working at Stanford Research Institute, and were coming up on weekends, one to, of course, plant and do everything else. But then once harvest began, harvesting the grapes and putting them in the fermenter and letting the natural yeast take over. And they wouldn't be back again until the next weekend, and that they were free. And so it was a great system for them, because by submerging the grapes, they would get maximum extraction without any chance of acidification, that is, a volatile acidity taking off if the air is in contact with the skins. So it held, these grids hold the grapes, or I don't know, 3-4 inches below the surface of the liquid. And all the way through fermentation, we do pump over now to get things started, to aerate the juice. But initially they were barely doing that and just holding it submerged. So that's where it came from. We actually used to do it with Cabernet back in the 60s. And then gradually we shifted to the traditional method of pumping over for Cabernet. But occasionally, like this, where Zinfandel, will still use it. And John, you might mention that the difference between Paso in the regional character of the wines is a good comparison of what you'll talk about later, which is East Bench. That is also 100% Zinfandel, but up there in Dry Creek. And you can see the regional difference between the Paso and the East Bench. So there's that as a clear character of this wine.
Yeah, that sounds kind of like a good segue into our next wine. Would you say, David? Or?
Yeah, I would say so. And maybe you can feather in a question, John, as you move to East Bench about, clearly East Bench is going to have more tannin than the Paso. Why is the Paso lower in tannin, and what can you attribute that to?
Well, It's a great question. I don't know if I have all the answers. I think one of the first things to point out, I think, is that I think it's easy to think that Zinfandel, because it is a grape which it's a grape that will produce a lot of sugar. It will make a big wine, depending on your intentions, but it certainly can make a fairly voluminous wine. But the grape doesn't necessarily have that much tannin in the skin if you compare it to, Cabernet and much more phenolic wines. And so I do think there's a little bit both in terms of it being a bit warmer in Paso. I think it makes this wine that is, again, a little rounder and doesn't have quite the tannins that you get when you're in Dry Creek. I think there's probably an effect also of the soil that it's being grown in, because they're certainly very different. David could give us more details in terms of the soil here at East Bench, but there's no question that in Dry Creek with Zinfandel, there does tend to be a little bit more of a darker fruit and that sort of a tannic grip, which just seems to come with Zinfandel that's grown in this area.
Yeah, it's so obvious when you try these wines side by side. The fruit is so much darker in East Bench, and there's so much more grip to the wine, which is really still amazing for 100% Zinfandel. But maybe talk about, John, how this has evolved over the 20 years in terms of the style of the wine has really changed since we first planted the vineyard.
Well, yeah, it's I think that's also an important difference, is that obviously down at Paso in the Doozy Vineyard, we're dealing with much older vines, which were first planted going all the way back into the 30s, whereas at East Bench, this is a vineyard which we planted in 1999 and 2000. So we're dealing with vines which are just approaching 20 years. And for the first 3 years when we were harvesting it, these grapes actually went into into Three Valleys as young vines. But as the concentration sort of built up, as the vines matured, our first East Bench was in 2006, and I think with each passing year we see a wine that it gets the fruit gets a little darker, we get a little more intensity, and another important factor too, especially when you're dealing with 100% Zin in both of these vineyards, but I think especially at East Bench, is it's amazing the natural acidity this wine has. When you're growing pure Zinfandel, one of the things you can frequently be fighting is low acidity in the form of higher pH, and this is a wine that comes in with just beautifully balanced fruit.
Yeah, absolutely. And David, maybe you want to comment on the soils at East Bench versus Paso, and also because East Bench abuts Lytton Springs, how the soils differ from East Bench versus Lytton as well. It is a very unique soil type.
Sure. So here it is in the photo. It's very red, lots of iron oxides in the soil. It's some of the oldest soil that we have up that we farm up at Lytton. And East Bench is all of this. So it's called Site Series, and it's basically an old, very old alluvial bench, old geologically for soils, not super old, but it's like mid-age, so about 40 or so million years old, which means that it was formed several ocean rises and falls before the more recent alluvium, like we'll be tasting at Geyserville, or what makes up some of the other soil types at Lytton Springs. So it was laid down by a river, probably when the rivers were going east and west in California instead of kind of north and south. The soils then are deeply weathered, so there's less loam and a little more clay in these soils, so the vines have to struggle. They don't quite get as big as you would see in more recent alluvium, like you'd see down at Paso, for instance, which those soils are maybe 2 million years old, something like that. The other thing that is unique about this site is that it had vines on it before Prohibition, but they were pulled out either during or slightly after Prohibition. And for the last, until we replanted it in 2000 or so, they had the owners had animals running on it, whether they were cows or sheep or horses. So there's a lot of turf was grown, so a lot more organic matter, and that organic matter over many years has become more stable. So that really does help with nutrient retention, helps the vines grow a little better, and helps buffer the vines for the heat that they see in the summer.
Great. Yeah, thank you, David. Paul, we have a question. All the wines we're tasting today that Zinfandel or Zinfandel blends are head trained. Why is that advantageous, and why do we prefer that to grapes grown on wire or trellis?
Well, I'll make my comments and then we'll have David comment.
Yeah.
Because over the years, especially going back quite a ways, we had blocks, especially at Lytton, that were cordon pruned on wire, and we had blocks that were the older vines that were head trained. And even when we had replanted head trained that were roughly the same age as the cordon, and this is my personal opinion, but in our blind tastings, we had consistently preferred the complexity and the intensity of the head trained vines over the cordon. And so given that that's how Zinfandel was traditionally pruned, and had made such great wines, our early Geyservilles, where it was all head trained vines, and our early Lytton the same way. Mm-hmm. That's what we've continued with. It's perhaps part of our use of tradition in winemaking. But David, what are your comments?
You know, what I've seen is, and I kind of think that it has to do with the amount, too technical and geeky, but a little bit, is that as you grow out a cordon vine, you have roughly double or even more the amount of wood that you store up. And the vines typically for cordon trained vines are a little bit higher up on the ground, at least the way we grow them in California. So they grow more vigorously, they intercept more sunlight. So there's a little bit more nutrition going into the buds and the clusters. And so what we found was that you ended up with, Zinfandel is a big clustered variety anyway, but you would end up with clusters that were a little bit fuller, a little bit tighter. And we had to actually do more work with them once in order to try to increase their intensity. The head trained vines are a little bit more difficult to prune initially until you get those arms established and get them spread out. But once you do that, they tend to come into balance a little bit more readily or more quickly than a cordon vine. And so I just think it's a matter of vine balance and maybe having the clusters set a little bit less so that you get a little bit smaller berries and maybe a touch more intensity. But we certainly did see that. I remember that was mid 90s when we'd just taken over Lytton West, and we looked at those blocks and did everything the same. It was the same crop level, and it was, one, if we were making through, I think, what did we call Three Valleys back then, Paul?
Coast Range.
Coast Range. So one of them was Coast Range and the other was Lytton. It was pretty night and day, pretty amazing. And those cordon vines didn't last very long after that.
No.
Yeah.
Good, great explanation. Thanks, David, and thanks, Paul. I think we're going to move to our third Zinfandel or Zinfandel blend, which is Geyserville. These are the oldest vines that we work with. It's a vineyard that we wholly own now, and it's a site that we think is probably one of the greatest sites to grow Zinfandel anywhere in the world. We're a little biased, but we do truly feel that. But John, maybe you want to kick us off on Geyserville and talk about what you think really sets this site apart and makes it such a great place to grow Zinfandel and Zinfandel blends.
Yep, sure. It's certainly one of our first Zinfandel vineyards that we ever started working with, going all the way back to 1966. Yeah. And certainly in the lineup we have here today, the first, the first thing that stands out is that, here we are moving to the classic California field blend. So unlike what we were saying about Doozy Vineyard and East Bench, here at Geisville, we, especially if you look at the old patch, we're dealing with, majority Zinfandel, but then followed quickly by complementary varietals, most notably at Geisville, Carignan, and then Petite Syrah. And I think that, the fact that Carignan usually makes up almost 20% of this wine is significant because it's one of the things that I think it really brings this brightness and acidity and really kind of shapes the character in some ways of the wine. And it's amazing, in a lot of ways it's amazing to think that I certainly think there was a method to the madness. In other words, these were vineyards which were being planted over 100 years ago, and I think they were definitely choosing varietals that that really make sense. I mean, you're getting this beautiful upfront fruit from Zinfandel, but then you're getting this nice acidity from the Carignan, and then of course Petite Syrah brings that color and structure to the wine. So it's even though we call it Zinfandel, it really is, when you taste Geisville, and we have the opportunity to do that year after year, you really can see this character, in the vineyard. It's,
And John, David makes a great point that this is on a strip of soil. I've forgotten how you call that strip, that is old riverbed and has a lot of rocks in it, and is also, again, like East Bench, a single soil for the whole vineyard. And on pieces of it that are in the Geisville Township, or even in a vineyard, move outside that that soil, and those simply do not make the Geisville. They don't taste like Geisville. So that soil really makes a difference. David, what do you think?
Yeah, it's kind of night and day right there, Paul. So the soils you're talking about, it's called Pleasanton Gravelly Loam. Emphasis on the gravel. It's all river run, recent alluvium. The deeper you go into that soil, it's very deep, and the deeper you go, the more river rock you get, and the rounded rocks. Not very far away from that, or right, adjacent to that, to the east toward Russian River, is a more recent alluvium where the river was running fairly slowly as it laid it down, so it's much more clay and completely different. It's Zinfandel doesn't like that because it's a little bit too wet in the springtime. Petite Syrah doesn't mind it, Merlot doesn't mind it, but it's not that good for Zin. If you go into the hills, it's an older soil, and it's much more eroded, washed down, and higher in magnesium, which Zinfandel also doesn't like. So other varieties can grow there, but Zinfandel really excels in this little lens, gravel lens, which, I always jokingly say, unfortunately, I'd say half of the acreage there, and it's not there, it's less than a half mile wide, probably a quarter mile wide, maybe a couple miles long. Most of it's covered by freeway or wineries or whatever. It's not, it should all be Zin vineyards, but oh well. But yeah, it's a great place for Zin, and you can't really tell just looking at it. It's less than 5% slope, but it's absolutely amazing. And I'm certainly glad that that Dave Benyon, our first winemaker, struck up a friendship with the Trentadoes, and then Paul got his hands on that fruit starting in '69, and we were able to work with it for all these years.
I think
And
that's an interesting question, David, for Paul, is that, Geyserville is one of the few things that predates Montebello Ridge. And when you arrived in 69 and you saw this wine, I don't know how much experience you had with Zinfandel at that point, but I mean, what did you think and what were your early impressions?
well, I had literally not had any wine, I don't think, labeled Zinfandel. And if anything, it was Red Mountain and, Gallows, Gallows wine that had a lot of Zinfandel, maybe most, but it was generic. And getting to Ridge and tasting the complexity and the intensity and the interest in good Zinfandel was just a huge eye-opening experience for me, because I had been tasting Cabernets, particularly Bordeaux's, but also the old California Cabernets. And of course, that's when I got to Montebello, that's what I found clearly. We had an incredible chance to make some of the finest, but here was this Zinfandel. And so for that point on, I had this divided interest, and particularly starting to drink a wine a little earlier than the Cabernets, the Zinfandel was perfect. And I was going to mention that, and we can go back to David, the acidity from the Carignan is major, but the Geyserville Zinfandel has higher acidity than any other vineyard we work with. And there have been years when we've even had to slightly lower that acidity to make a balanced wine. And David, I know it's a speculation, but why do you think Geyserville has this great acidity in the Zinfandel itself?
Well, it's not climate, because if you look climatically, it's pretty much the same. Lytton and Geyserville, they're less than 2 miles apart. It has to be the soils. They do share that soil series type, that Pleasanton, but what we find, if you look at the chemical analysis, the mineral balance of the Geyserville soils versus the Lytton Springs soil, the Pleasanton series, which is right outside our winery there, the calcium magnesium ratio is off the charts at Geyserville. It's like 8 or so to 1, where typically outside the winery at Lytton, it's more like 3 to 1, which is great. Zinfandel loves that. 8 to 1, people would say, oh, you need to add magnesium, but what that does is, I think it just creates maybe less stress on the vine so that they can retain more acidity. That's a whole other thing. A whole other issue, we could talk for hours about. The other thing that I see versus, say, comparing those old vines at Lytton versus at Geyserville, are the Geyserville vines just kind of chug along, and even they're seeing basically the same weather, but their roots maybe are slightly deeper. They're less stressed, and I think that they attain their sugar levels more easily. And their flavor matches that, so we're able to pick it and still retain all that acidity. But that's a guess. I don't know. It's alchemy in the vineyard. Who knows?
That's a great answer, David. One last question on Geyserville for John about field blends. And I think there's 22 different varieties out in the field at Geyserville, or some number around there, John. But do we do selective harvest? Do we harvest together? What, and how does that impact the winemaking?
Yeah, again, I think it's one of the really, it's sort of uncanny the way in which it works, because obviously there's lots and lots and lots of grape varietals out there in the world, and if you were to take something that's very late ripening, say Cabernet, and you put that in a vineyard blend with Zinfandel, and you pick those together, I think you'd have. I don't think it would work. And yet, when we have these field blends that have Carignan, that have Petit Syrah, that have Zinfandel, all interplanted, we've actually picked them separately to see, if we get better results, and we always prefer it when we pick them together. And Carignan, I mean, one of the interesting things, I mean, Carignan it's a grape which actually will ripen at lower sugar. So you can have Zinfandel that say is at 25 and a half bricks, and Carignan that's at 23 or 23 and a half, and physiologically they're both right. And I think that's one of the reasons that it really works. But it's, yeah, there's just something about the co-fermentation that just seems to make everything kind of come together in a way that it wouldn't if we were to keep those varietals separate.
Yeah.
And John,
absolutely.
take off from that, haven't we learned that when we replant another varietal or an old, non-performing Zinfandel parcel, that we now plant it as a mix of typically Carignan, Petit Syrah, and Zin, and that we can make the wine comes together earlier when it's younger, the vines are younger, and the final wine is better and more complex than 100% young Zin.
Yeah, I think there's no question about it. One of the ways that we learned this was by we planted some pure Zinfandel blocks, and as those came in, we just noticed that blocks, which were the field blends nearby, we always preferred those. So we took out one of those blocks, replanted it with a full mixture of complementary varietals, including some whites, and immediately saw the better results.
Awesome. Good. So let's move to our final wine, which is the 2018 Estate Cabernet. And David, let's sort of go back to the vineyard and talk about this a little bit here. Montebello is such a unique site, a mountain vineyard, 20 miles from the ocean, so different from anything else in California in terms of growing Bordeaux varieties. And you could argue unique in the world in terms of location. But all that being said, how does that manifest itself in a glass, and what makes this wine so unique, and how does it relate to the site?
So if you look at this this map, it shows the Montebello Ridge, which is actually the key to this wine, I'd say. The ridge itself is made up of this Franciscan era, so 140 to 180 million years ago, rock or dirt that was formed way back then, that is roughly maybe 50% of this really ancient limestone, and the other 50% greenstone, which turns red, of course, as it oxidizes. It was actually from the Farallon plate, and it was stuck onto the North American plate, and you can see the San Andreas Fault, which is right below us to the west, and that is the dividing line between the North American plate, where we are at Montebello, and the Pacific plate, which is about half of the Santa Cruz Mountains appellation. So that soil is the first part. The limestone is very important for grapevines because these ancient soils are so highly weathered that they can strip out a lot of the nutrients and actually lower the pH of the soil, which is not, if it gets too low, it's not good for grapevines. They can't really extract the right minerals. They get some toxicities. Limestone helps counterbalance that. It sweetens the soil. So that really keeps it, and it also holds water really well. So that's all really good for the vines. Our location in the bay is such that we can just barely get Cabernet right. We can talk a lot about that, but it's mainly because we're above the inversion layer where we grow most of our Cabernet. And so we're warm at night, so the vines are still kind of working. The enzymes are still working on the vines, in the vines, because it's warm. And then during the day, it never gets all that hot. So as the fog burns off from the valley, from that inversion layer that we talked about with the Chardonnay, it keeps it keeps us a little bit cooler than at the valley floor, the way it heats up. So basically we're talking about Paso Robles, and the diurnal curve is huge, like 40-50 degrees. At Montebello, especially at Peroni Vineyard at the upper winery, or Torre, which is where our tasting room is, that diurnal curve can be as short as flattened as 2 to 5 degrees sometimes. It's amazing. And then that's great because the enzymes are working so that it gets ripe, physiologically ripe. The tannins get ripe at lower sugars. So we can get this wine in typically at much lower bricks. And then the coastal influence, the fact that we are so close to the bay and the ocean, keeps it very bright acidity. And that makes for a very unique, long aged wine. And John can talk about our selection process for the Estate Cab versus our Montebello. But in the vineyard, we're kind of looking at it like we try to make sure that we try to grow our vines as balanced as possible. So my goal is to get every single lot into Montebello. I know that's never going to happen, but that's the way we look at it. So the vines that are bigger, we put more crop on them to slow them down so that the flavors come around more quickly. The pyrazines burn off. And then it's up to the intensity. That's what tells us what goes into Montebello and what goes into Estate Cabernet. So the Estate Cab, while being less intense than the Montebello, still is, I think, quite complex and can age beautifully.
And David, if I could follow on that before John steps in, for years, following on your thing that we wanted every block to go in. First of all, when you joined us coming down from Napa and from Davis, Napa, where the yields were much higher, you had to quickly adapt to the fact that if you left that much crop on our vines, winter would come and we would not have ripe grapes. So right from the beginning, you quickly learned that you had to set much less on the vines. And luckily, because we were seamlessly able to go right on from where we had been before, once you joined us. But the other thing was that we, for years, up until about 15 years ago, would taste through all of the parcels. And in those previous 30 years or more, as we planted more of the ridge, that is down at Rooston and Klein and so on, we had, I think we got up to where we are now at 40 parcels. And we were tasting through those to see which ones would go into the estate and which into the Montebello. And about 15 years ago, we analyzed what had happened over 30 years and saw that the same parcels went into the estate and the same parcels went into the Montebello every year, with just 1 or 2 or 3 parcels moving back and forth. And so at that point, we could really look at what is the character of the vines or of the parcels. And we still don't know quite what makes that difference, but that make this typical estate and then make this more intense, far longer aging Montebello with perhaps somewhat more depth, but as you said, so it's not as the French would say, a second wine. It is in fact the difference of the wine that those parcels produce. And those are the estate parcels, and then there are the Montebello parcels.
Yeah, John, I want to go a little deeper into that in terms of people always do wonder about the difference between Montebello and the Estate Cabernet, and is it a second wine? Is it not a second wine? And Paul's really sort of set that up, but maybe you want to talk about the selection process and how that all plays out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the big one of the big advantages we have at Ridge, when I first joined Ridge, it was immediately apparent, is when we talk about Montebello Vineyard, we're talking about a vineyard which we've been working with the relatively same types of varietals from the same blocks for decade after decade after decade. And it was interesting because of what Paul was saying. I feel like when I joined Ridge in the 90s, it seemed like we were kind of getting to that point where you're tasting through 35 or so separate different blocks, which have all been fermented separately. And there's this kind of going around the room, it's like, oh yeah, it's that block, right? Well, we know that block's always just a little softer, right? Put it over here. And year after year after year, and finally you're like, okay, so this group of, these blocks for mainly this part of the ranch tend to be maybe a little more forward. Maybe the quality of the tannins isn't quite as tight knit, it doesn't have quite that intensity that we get from these blocks maybe a little farther up the hill. And I think it was really kind of a natural, I think things just sort of fell into two groups in that way. So yes, again, we're not talking about, this is the top one and then this one over here is just, I've said it before. I mean, Paul may shudder at it, but there's been times when I felt almost like, wow, these wines are actually so good. We could actually put them both together and call it Montebello. But the fact is they are different enough that they do merit two separate bottles.
And John, to follow on that, when we blind taste the estate against the Montebello as it's aging, once it's been put together, and before bottling and after bottling, for me, I am more nervous about that tasting because I'm almost sure I'm going to pick the estate over the Montebello in my blind tasting. And luckily, I've somehow picked up the difference and been able to separate. But for me, it's so close. They're both so good in their own way.
Yeah. And I think that's especially true for me, at least, in 18, because in 18 was, the yields were pretty intense. I mean, in other words, I think there's a concentration to the wine in both the Montebello and in the estate. It's the richness and just that concentration is really incredible.
Yeah, I think you both are pointing to the fact of what a great value this wine is in terms of how close it is to Montebello, but definitely a little softer, a little different, a little more, you can drink it a little earlier. But looking at the price of Estate Cabernet versus Montebello, you understand what a great value it is. I'm conscious of everyone's time. We've just gone over an hour. So, and I know there's a lot of great questions we didn't get to, and I apologize that I've been going through, but the conversation has been flowing so well, I didn't want to disturb it. But we will answer all those questions in writing. And we want to thank you all for your participation today. We hope everyone is doing well and is healthy and happy out there and dealing with all the challenges of COVID in a positive way. And we're looking forward to restaurant business coming back just like you are, and hopefully that'll be coming back before the end of the year. And we're excited to go back into that part of the market and re-engage all of our friends in the on-premise side of the business. Look forward to seeing you again in September for our fall release tasting. So we'll look forward to that. We'll look forward to getting these kits out to you again. Maybe a few more of them will get out. This has been so successful. I thought the wines all tasted great coming out of the small vials. I didn't think there was any issues with that at all. So a thanks to our panelists, to John, to David, and to Paul for joining us this morning. Thank you for your time and your expertise. We appreciate it. And again, most of all, thanks to all of you out there for joining us and tasting through the wines. Good luck with the spring release. Hopefully you're extremely successful. So thanks everyone, and have a great weekend. Bye for now.